Hi, I'm Colin with Western Interlock, and today we're back here to do a couple more seminars. The first seminar we're going to be doing is install concrete interlocking paving stones, and the second seminar is a basic grille surround. So as I'm going along here, I'm going to be using our 10-step instructions on how to install paving stones. You can access this on our website. It's just pretty basic, it's pretty vague as well, but if you need any more information than what I tell you or what is on the 10 steps, then you can refer to all of our blogs and videos. So step one is design. A lot of you have probably already done this. If you haven't, or just a good thing to do is to put it on a piece of graph paper. That way when you draw it out, you have a good reference for each square being a square foot. So when you order your materials and you kind of get a guesstimate on how much you're going to excavate, that graph paper will have a better idea of showing that. But what I typically do is on my piece of graph paper, I have a small outline of my house. And for reference for the class, I'm just going to do a 10 by 20 patio. Easy math, pretty good size, pretty common. So there's our patio off the back side of our house. So you draw this on your graph paper. And you can add some curves and whatnot if you want to at that point. Either way, once you've got a good design on a piece of graph paper, you can go to step 2, which is layout. So if you go outside your house and you actually mark this on the ground, just for reference, you always want to use white marking paint when marking an outline for a project that's going to be excavated. Any other color is a utility, and before you excavate, you're going to want to make sure you get a locate, and any other color than white will confuse the locating guys. So you go outside and you mark your area the size that you want with marking paint, and when you're back there, it's better to see how big or small you really want your project to be because you're looking at it. And this would be a good time also if you wanted to add some to round off your corners or make it bigger or smaller. But basically once you've established that, you can move on to step 3, which is get it square. So typically being square has its most advantage when laying your paving stones, because you're always laying off a pattern, and in order to lay it efficiently, you want to lay it square so that all your lines match up and it can be checked along the way. But we always like to get it square before we even excavate. That way we excavate square and we can minimize the over excavation that may happen if you just mark it out with marking paint. So mark it out with your marking paint. It's always good too to add an extra 6 inches around the edge of where you want your paving stones to be. And you're going to need to do that so that you have base past the edge of your paving stones for better retention. But for getting it square, first thing you have to do is set a couple stakes along the side of your foundation. And then you're going to stretch a string line across here. And no matter what anybody says, concrete foundation is never perfectly straight. But what you would do is you're going to move this string in and out and get it as close as you can to your concrete foundation without touching it. And that will make sure that you're perfectly straight with your house. Then you're going to set your other line, and what you're going to want to do is go where the edge of your paving stones are going to be. You cross that line. And then in order to establish square, you have to do what's called the 3-4-5 triangle or Pythagorean theorem, which is basically you measure 3 feet this way and mark it, measure 4 feet this way and mark it. If you stretch your tape measure across here at 5 feet between mark to mark, then you know that you're perfectly square. And like I said, this has the best advantage when laying paving stones, but it also helps keep you from under or over digging, because if you just kind of eyeball your area, you might have a little bit of under excavation. So you've made it square. Then you can move on to step 4, which is set the grade. So a common misconception with paving stones is people think that they can just put them anywhere perfectly level and flat and they're made to drain through. There is a type of paving stone called permeable paving stones that is specifically designed for them to be able to drain through, but the most common type of paving stones called sand set paving stones don't work that way, and you have to have some slope in order for the water to properly drain off of them. So for a quick reference, if we have a 10 by 20 patio, obviously you want your slope to go away from any house or structure. Our rule of thumb for slope is about an 1/8 inch per linear foot. And I'm going to demonstrate that on this gravel frame here too, just to kind of quickly show you. But if you use this first line that you used for square and first thing you have to do is establish your grade, which is where you want the top of your paving stone. So if this line across the back of your patio is matching up with your threshold or your door, you're going to make that level. Then once that line is level, you're going to move on to this line. If it's touching here, and then you make this one level, they're all the same level. And then you're come down here to this bottom line and drop it 1.25 inches, which is 1/8 inch per foot, away from your house. And I'm going to demonstrate that too here. So these are my stakes. I'm going to put one right here, put one down here, take a string line. This can be the line running down away from your house on your patio. Bring it down here, wrap it a couple times around your stake. It's nice if you use the one that you used for square, just because it's kind of already set up. So we've got our string line there, and you got to use a string line level first to make sure it's level. Pretty high in the back. Lower it, okay. So we've established level. Then you can go down to your bottom stake away from your house. Like I said, we're going to go to about 1.25 inches. Mark that. You can untie your string line really quickly. Put it on that mark. Wrap it around there twice. Pull the slack out, okay? So now we have grade and a reference to excavate and base from. Now obviously just one of those lines probably isn't going to be enough. For me personally, I like to set them about every 4 or 5 feet apart. So if we have a 10 by 20 patio, I'm going to have about 4 of these lines. And like I said, if you have the lines touching this top line and you establish your level first, and then you drop them 1.25 inches just like you did with that first line, you'll have a consistent grade across your entire project which you can use to excavate and to base from. So once you've established that, you have good guides to use throughout your project. So that's step 4, which is set the grade. Now we're going to move on to step 5, which is excavate. Just really briefly, this is probably the part of the process that is hardest for an average homeowner, mainly because of the quantity of material you have to remove. So within a 200 square foot patio, you're going to have about 5 yards of dirt. You won't bring in that much of gravel or sand back. So to get your gravel, sand, and paving stones delivered is very easy, but there's not always a service that can come and excavate and haul away your dirt. So whatever's going to make that process easier for you, whether it's renting an excavator or a piece of digging equipment or a dump trailer and dump truck, like I said, this is the hardest part and probably going to be the most amount of material you're going to move. And right off the bat, it's going to sound kind of like it'll get pretty expensive if you add all these rental fees of, your dump trailer, dump truck, compactor, saws, and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, there's basically no way that this project can cost you more to do yourself than if you were to hire somebody. So I know that it may seem like some of those bills and costs are stacking up and might seem comparable, but at the end of the day, there's no way you can be more expensive to do this yourself than if you were to hire a contractor. So that being said, if you have to rent a dump truck or a truck and a dump trailer, whatever you have to do to efficiently move that material as fast as you can is the best. Like I said, you can use an excavator. That's probably the easiest, but if you've never ran any equipment before, there's a little bit of a learning curve there. So if that's the case where you're going to have to hand dig, make sure that you have a pickaxe and a lot of people there to help you, because it's going to be a long process. And also, before you get excavating, like I had previously stated before with the marking paint, you want to make sure before you really dig into this ground that you get a locate done. You will be liable if you hit any utility throughout that process if you do or don't get a locate done. So either way, it's best to know. And also, most of the time, people don't have a lot of things going on in their backyards, but it's always good just to be sure before you really get going on that. So when you're excavating, like I said, whether it's machine or hand digging, you're using these lines as a reference. And the amount you will have to excavate can depend on the type of or the thickness of the paving stone. But the most common thickness of paving stone is 60 millimeter or 2 3/8 inches. So if you take that 2 3/8, then you add the standard spec 1 inch of bedding sand, and then you add the spec for residential applications for patios and walkways, which is 4 inches of compacted gravel. You have about 7 3/8. But there is a lot of paving stones that get compacted. So within that process, you will lose that 3/8 inches. So 7 inches is our typical rule of thumb for excavation. So you're going to go along these string lines and you're going to dig 7 inches below them, get a good reference going, and you're going to dig in between them as close as you can. If you need to run any more string lines through this process, you can, that's fine. Just make sure you're 7 inches below all the way across. It's always good to dig as straight as a good sidewalls for your gravel to stay retained in. But whatever you need to do to get 7 inches below that string line as fast as you can, that's optimal. And then if you accidentally over dig in any parts of that process, it's never acceptable to backfill with dirt. You always want to backfill with gravel, because when you dig up dirt, it becomes disturbed and loose. And if you try to put it back in, even if you compact it, it's never going to be as tight as it once was. So if you accidentally over excavate in a couple areas, it's fine. Just make sure that you build it back up with gravel, not dirt. Once you're pretty confident that you have everything nice and clean, 7 inches below all those string lines, then we can move on to step 5, which is the set the base. And you're going to want to leave these string lines for the base too, because that can help you check your grade along with that too. But before we put the gravel in, you want to make sure that you use some of this stuff called geotextile. What this is a high tensile strength woven polymer fabric that is specifically designed to separate dirt from migrating into your gravel. That can promote settling faster, so you don't want that. If you want a long-lasting project, it's always good to invest in something like that. And it's pretty cheap. So it's basically what we call a cheap insurance policy. So it'll keep that dirt from migrating into your gravel, and also if there's any minor settling here and there, because of its high tensile strength, it can bridge that and prevent that from happening as fast. So you excavate your dirt. Before you put your gravel in, make sure you lay some geotextile down. And you see we have it wrapped up these sidewalls here. You'd want to do that same thing on your project, just to have a little bit of extra retention and strength there. So step 6, set the base. You've got your geotextile down. Then you're going to bring in 3/4 minus. That's the spec for most states. If you have any other state besides Oregon or Washington, Washington's 5/8 minus, but depending on your state's Department of Transportation spec, you could have a different type of gravel, but most cases it's 3/4 minus crushed gravel. So like I said, you're using these string lines as a reference, and if we excavated 7 inches and we need 4 inches of gravel, we're going to basically measure 3 inches down from each one of these string lines and use that as our reference to bring it up to the right grade. But depending on the type of compactor you have, most commonly you'll have a smaller plate compactor that's most readily available via your rental yards. Those compactors will work just fine, but you just want to make sure that you compact in 2-inch lifts. If you can get a heavier duty compactor and have the equipment to get it to your backyard, you won't have to do as many lifts. But in order to have the proper compaction, you want to make sure you do them in 2-inch lifts with those small plate compactors. That way it's nice and tight and you'll have a longer lasting project. So you bring in 2 inches of gravel, spread it out as nice and flat as you can, compact it. It's also good to keep some moisture on this. If you got your materials delivered prior, you can just lightly mist it with the hose. You don't want it too wet to where water's pumping out of it, but you do want it moist a little bit so that compacts better. So bring in 2 inches, compact it, bring in an additional 2 inches, compact it. And then by then, you'll really be taking your time and checking underneath these lines and make sure it's perfectly 3 inches. Once you're confident with that, then you can move on to taking a 2x4 and basically raking over the gravel to help split any of the indifferences between your string lines to make sure it's perfectly flat. So you've been using your string lines as a reference. You've checked 3 inches below, you've compacted it, then you've taken down your string lines and you've raked it with the 2x4 to kind of split any indifferences, and then you want to compact it one final time, and then after that you're ready to screed your sand, which is step 7. So the type of sand you're going to use is washed concrete sand. That's the spec. And as I had stated earlier in the excavation stage, I said you needed 1 inch of bedding sand. So in order to maintain 1 inch perfectly across your entire project, you want to use something 1 inch outside diameter. So I have some 1 inch outside diameter metal square tubing. You can use metal round tubing. That works just fine. People have used PVC, but it's not very heavy. So when you try to screed it, the pipes will move. So something heavy and 1 inch outside diameter is basically all you really need. So you're going to lay it on your compacted gravel, and this is a good time to check level. So you'd want to check level crosswise across your patio. It typically helps when screeding to kind of screed in the direction of your slope. So you have your rails here just kind of like I do. Check it level this way, and then you can also check your grade this way, and then you can check each rail to make sure they're consistent. However much checking you want to do, that's fine. But once you feel confident that they're at a nice consistent grade, you can bring in your sand. So grab a wheelbarrow. Typically you could just dump your sand in, but in this case, got to shovel it all in. That's okay, it won't take long, it's not that much sand. So you'll notice that this sand is wet. This is important because it screeds better when it's wet, it's tighter and more compact, but also when you go to lay your paving stones on there, because it's wet and tight and compact, it'll be a lot more firm. If it's dry, it'll be too loose, or if it's too wet, it'll pump water out of it and can settle faster. So if you got this delivered too before, just like the gravel, just spritz it with the garden hose, maybe mix it around a little bit. But you want it moist. Also, because you want it moist, it's a good rule of thumb not to screed more than what you can lay in a day. One person by themselves in 4 to 6 hours can screed and lay about 100 square feet in 4 to 6 hours. But if you have multiple people with you, you could do a little bit more. So if you set the flattest 2x4 you can find on these rails, typically you'd want to pull it. That's the easiest way to do it, but for the sake of the video, I want to show me pushing it. See, this sand is wet, and it's screeding across here pretty good. Occasionally you'll find a piece of gravel or something that will kind of make a nick in it, but just pull that piece of gravel out and top it off again. And if your rails aren't quite long enough to do your whole length, that's just fine. You just slide them once you feel comfortable. It's also a lot easier if you leave one rail in to reuse on the next section, if you have enough rails to do that. Just that way it also helps you keep more consistent. Slide your rails down, top it off here and there. Need a lot more sand. So like I said, you only want to screed what you can lay in one day. That way, if the sun's sitting, or if the sand is sitting in the sun, it doesn't dry it out too much. Or if it happens to rain, it doesn't saturate your sand. You can cover it with your paving stones. So just finish it off here. One more time. Wow. Really scraping for sand. So like I said, get to the end, just pull it off. And obviously you don't want to keep your rails in here. I'm going to pull them out and fill in those joints. These nice long channels without sand. The easiest way to do this is with a trowel, or if you can find a really flat broom, that works well too. But since I know I'm not laying all the way to the edge, I can use a little bit of this sand and top it off. And that's another good rule of thumb too. Since you're excavating and basing 6 inches past your paving stones, it's also good to screed past where you want the edge of your paving stones. That way you don't just lay right up to your edge and your paving stones will slough off if there's not enough sand there. So it's always good to screed past it in order to have a little bit better performing edge. Just trowel that as flat as you can. And that should be good enough. So you pulled down your string line for grade before you boarded it to make sure it was nice and flat and compacted one more time. But hopefully If you didn't keep these first square lines up, you can just put them back up. It's always a good rule of thumb to keep your stakes marked. That way if you break a string line throughout the process, you can just retie them on the marks and a little bit quicker. But if you don't have these square lines anymore, put them back up and get them as close as you can to where they were. I don't have a big enough area to really worry about being perfectly square, but if you want to refrain from a lot of cutting, it's always good to lay nice and square. So we've screeded our sand up step 7. Now we can move on to step 8, which is laying the stones. If you took down these first 2 lines you set up for square in the beginning, you want to make sure you want to put those back up to lay off of. That way you can maintain straight and refrain from a lot of cuts. And you utilize all of your excavated base properly. So I have a small enough area where I don't have to worry about laying perfectly square. But the type of stone we're using today is called Camino stone. We're using the rectangles and squares. The pattern is the Muster K pattern or I pattern. And the color is Columbia. So our brochure does a pretty good job of showing you how to lay stones and patterns without cuts. So I know for a fact on at least 2 of these edges I won't have any cuts. But depending on where I end on those other 2 edges, I could have some cuts. But sometimes if you have enough area or extra base to where you still have room for your restraint, you can just lay it and save some cuts. So I'll show you here what I'm talking about. So I know if I go to this 3rd square, I won't have any cuts there on that outside line. Here. This one. And once your area that you're laying is big enough to stand on, you can stand on these, that's fine. It's not going to mess anything up. Stand on them. We always recommend laying with what's called the click and drop method, which is where basically you meet it into the corner and drop it down. If you kind of set it in the sand before you drop it and you kind of try and tuck it, you could bring some sand into that joint, and then it'll make an ununiform sized joint and it'll be harder to maintain square and straight. Okay, so this edge too, I ended good, a nice module. And I understand in a lot of situations you're trying to utilize as much area as you can, so sometimes you can avoid cutting. If you do have to do any cutting, you want to go to a rental yard and try and get a saw. You can use a 10-inch tile saw even if you have a little bit of cuts. But whatever you have to do to get all those cuts done, whatever saw that is available, pretty much anything with a diamond blade will be able to cut these. Even a skill saw with a diamond blade, if you have just a few cuts, that can be done quick. If you want any more information on how to cut, we actually have a video on our website called 6 different ways to cut a paver. So there's a video and a blog, and it goes into pretty good detail if you have any questions about that. But fortunately, if you're in a situation like me where you could end it without any cuts, it's going to be a lot easier. So you laid it all. And then now we're going to talk about step 9, which is restraint. There's a few different types of edge restraint. We always talk about snap edge because it's the easiest to install. And snap edge is really cool because it's recycled plastic for one, and 2, it can do outside and inside curves. So there's no limitations to it basically. So the first thing you have to do is pull your sand away from the edge of your paving stones, and you want to use a trowel or a shovel. And also, quick tip, screeded. You always want to make sure that it is nice and wet before you pull it away with your trowel. If it's dry, it'll slough off underneath the edge of the paving stone. Then you'll have to pull up those paving stones and redo that edge. So mist it off with a hose. Just gonna go here. And the goal here is to scrape it down to the gravel. And the more uniform and flat your gravel is, where you put your snap edge, the more uniform and flat your edge of stones are going to stay. Just go in here, just going to pull it off the edge, sake of time. You'll see because this sand is nice and wet, it's just staying nice and uniform underneath the edge of these stones. If it was dry, it would just slough off and leave a void, have some more potential for settling. So go around your edge, pull it all away, as clean as you can. Then you're going to bring in your pieces of snap edge and use a certain amount of spikes, depending if it's a driveway or a walkway or patio. We're talking about a walkway patio situation, so you're going to use a spike every linear foot or for every third hole in the snap edge is where it lines up with. So typically you would want to use a 10-inch spike like I used for my grade stakes there. But since we're using a gravel frame that's limited to about 4 inches, I have some special 4-inch spikes. So you go around your edge, you always want to make sure you have one in the very corner. You're going to want to meet your snap edge as close together as you can to refrain from sand spilling out of your edge, your corner. So like I said, every third hole or every linear foot, if you're doing this for a driveway or something that's going to see a little bit of vehicular traffic, you're going to want to put every other hole or 8 inches. And when you come to an end, make sure you always have a stake in that end. Just tap them in around here. Watch your fingers. Work my way around here. Also, another good benefit of snap edge is it actually is the best restraint for grass to grow back in. So if you're meeting up with grass, this is pretty much your best option. Also, these stakes that you would want to use if you can't find snap edge branded or SEK branded spikes are just standard steel 10-inch nails. You want them to be standard steel, that way they rust and they actually will bond with the snap edge and grow in size in the gravel. Will actually become better over time. So you've installed your snap edge. This back edge I didn't put any snap edge on because for our situation we have it up against a concrete foundation, which is pretty common. Your concrete foundation can work as your restraint for that side. There's no problem with that. But in the beginning when we talked about getting straight with your foundation, the goal is to get as close as you can to that foundation. So obviously if there's any voids in there, you would just fill those voids with sand and that would be great. So you've put your edge restraint on, you've made any cuts before that if you needed to. Now we need to talk about step 10, which is finish. So the first part of that is to compact it. These type of paving stones do get compacted. Depending on the type of paving stones you install in your backyard, some of them might be more closer to what's called a slab or a larger paving stone. And our brochure does a pretty good job of, it has these icons in there of where basically if it's something that isn't supposed to be compacted, it will show a picture of a compactor with an X through it. But you might want to research that if you're using somebody else's paving stones. But basically this type of paving stone, along with a lot of paving stones, do get compacted. So you run your plate compactor over here and you can use the same type of plate compactor you use for your gravel, that small 150-pound plate compactor, that's perfect. You run it over both directions. Then you bring in your sweeping sand. The sweeping sand is what really gives paving stones an interlock. Basically, when you put sand in your joints, it puts pressure all the way up the sides and edges of your paving stones to where if you try to step on one corner or drive a car on one corner, it wouldn't be able to pivot out of that spot because of the pressure of the sand. So you put in your sand, and it's always good, a little tip, is to overfill the joints and then compact it that second time and last time, and that sand will work its way down in there a little bit. Then sweep off any excess sand. You want to refrain from a lot of excess sand or high filled joints, especially for a driveway, because you'll be kicking sand out of your joints with your car tires. The rule of thumb is an 1/8 inch below the bevel. So basically right there in that small void to where you can almost barely see it is good. Sweep it off, cover your edges with some dirt or sand or round rock, whatever is your finished edge. And that's basically a finished project. Obviously, we're from the Pacific Northwest, so you will have some moss and weed problems potentially, depending on where your project is. But there is a couple things I'd like to talk about that are preventative that you can do to refrain from that. So one thing is what's called polymeric sand. So polymeric sand is a sand that you would sweep in the joints dry, just like regular paver sand. You compact it just like regular paver sand, but you have to activate it with water, and it's pretty important that you don't get it wet before that. But either way, you activate it with water, and it hardens up, and it can prevent those moss and weeds. There's that option, and there's also a joint stabilizing seed. Stabilizing sealer can do two things. It can harden the sand in your joints to refrain from moss and weeds, and also puts like a clear coat on the top of your paving stones to keep the color and finish last longer. So no matter the type of way you want to finish your project, whether it's a preventative thing with the moss and weeds or just with regular sand, you're going to have the most optimal form of pavement out there and a project that, if it's installed correctly, will last a lifetime. So we're back and we're on to our second seminar, which is how to build a basic grille surround. There isn't currently a video of this, but there is a very detailed blog on this concept. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to take a grille that either came with or without stock wings. We're going to put some columns on either side of it, just basic columns. We're going to put some caps on it, and you're going to gain some counter space, and it's going to help tie your grille into your potential hardscape project, or just if you have an existing concrete patio. Either way, it'll help tie it in a little bit better instead of just a hunk of metal off to one side. So basically this is pretty easy. What you're going to do is establish a place for your grille and the two columns, place your grille, and then you're going to just, what we like to do is dry stack these blocks next to your grille. That way if you ever have to move it later on, or you do add more stuff like a bar or something later on, you can be able to take them down and tie it in. So what you'll do is place your grille, and then all you're doing is basically building two columns right next to your grille. So we're going to go ahead and just build one right now. And before you order your material, you can kind of pre-measure and check what's going to work best. I know with this grille, I got about 35 inches. So I'm going to do about a 32-inch column and put a 3-inch cap, and it's going to be right at the base of my hood. So it works perfectly for me, but depending on your grille, you could get a little bit shorter or taller and maybe use a different cap to help with that. Either way, start at the base of your column. It's okay if you start at the back of your grille. If you need to move your grille, either way you can. It's loose, it's just on the ground, but we always want to give about an inch of some ventilation room away from your grille. So start your column. And the type of block we're using today is a Chateau 300 millimeter, so it's an 8 by 12 by 4. It's going to make a 20-inch outside diameter column. We're going to be placing a 24-inch cap on top. So basic way to start a column, place your blocks, like I said, about an inch away from your grille for ventilation. Luckily, we're working off a nice flat cement floor. Hopefully your patio, whether paving stones or concrete that you're working with, is also very flat. If you don't have the space and you just need to add a strip of some slabs or paving stones outside the edge of your patio, you can make these level and then just build them off of those too. So either way, we're just going to stack it up. And like I said, I don't like to glue a situation like this because then it'll be harder to take apart if you ever have to move, or you buy a different grille that might be a little bit bigger a few years later. Either way, it's best just to, it's heavy enough to where it won't move, and it's modifiable if you need to. So we're going 32 inches, which is about 8 courses. So I know I only need 32 blocks for each side. That way I don't bring too much to my backyard, too much work. Like I said, we're just stacking this up. So we're already halfway. So like I said, this is just a good way to add something to help tie your grill in to your project or your existing patio. Depending on where you're located or what material you buy, it should only cost you between $300 and $400. But that also can depend on the size of the blocks and the capstone you choose. But all in all, it could be a pretty costly. Some counter space for your grill, and help your backyard look a little nicer. It's also very easy to assemble. Our last course here. For the sake of the video, I'm just kind of patting these as flush as I can make them. But when you build it, you can use some sort of straight edge. Might not be beneficial to use a level because if you're putting this on top of some paving stones or existing concrete, it's going to have a little bit of grade. But as straight up as you can make it, the better. So we've made our 32 inches of column. And we're just gonna throw on here, but we're gonna go ahead and build the other side and show you two different cap options that you can use. So we've thrown up our other column and we've placed some caps on here. On this side, we have the Murata Capello 24 inch by 24 inch cap. It's very thick and heavy and pretty clean edge. Depending on where the height of your grill stops, this could be optional. Like this is perfect, almost literally perfect with our hood. This would be a good option for this exact grill to match up with it. But then on this other side, we have just a Lalastra 24 by 24 inch stone. This is 1 inch thinner. And it also has spacer bars because it's more of a stepping stone, but it's a little bit more cost effective. And if it matches up with your grill a little bit better, like this would be fine. Both of them will give you that 8 feet of total counter space between the two, 4 on each side. Whichever one you want to go with is a good option. And all in all, this is just an easy, fast way to help tie your grill into your project.